pull up a chair. This is Revenge Kitchen, and tonight we're slow roasting justice.
The first anomaly appeared on a Tuesday morning in March, though I wouldn't recognize it as such until weeks later. Celeste stood at our kitchen island, scrolling through her phone with the kind of focused intensity usually reserved for work crises, her coffee growing cold beside her untouched yogurt parfait. "Everything okay?" I asked, adjusting my tie in the reflection of our stainless steel refrigerator. "Just work stuff," she replied without looking up, her thumbs moving rapidly across the screen. "Duncan's restructuring the quarterly reports again." Duncan Blackwood. I'd heard that name more frequently in recent months, always accompanied by a slight change in Celeste's tone, something I couldn't quite categorize but filed away in the systematic way I approached all puzzles. As a structural engineer, I'd learned that small shifts often indicated larger instabilities. "Sounds stressful," I offered, kissing the top of her head. Her shampoo smelled different, more expensive, with notes of bergamot I didn't recognize. She pulled away slightly, still focused on her phone. "I might be late tonight, team dinner to discuss the restructuring." Another data point. Celeste had mentioned team dinners 3 times in the past 2 weeks, but I'd never heard about them before January. I made a mental note as I grabbed my laptop bag and headed for the garage. The drive to my office usually provided thinking time, but that morning I found myself replaying our conversation. 14 years of marriage had taught me to read Celeste's moods like I read structural blueprints. Every line meant something, every detail served a purpose. But lately, the patterns felt different, like someone had altered the specifications without updating the plans. My office occupied the corner of a converted warehouse in northeast Minneapolis, all exposed brick and industrial windows that flooded my drafting table with natural light. I'd been with Thornfield Engineering for 12 years, working my way up from junior associate to senior project manager. The work suited my methodical nature. Every calculation had to be precise, every measurement verified, because people's lives depended on the integrity of the structures I designed. "You look like someone who's been thinking too hard," said Jennifer Chen, my project partner, as she set a cup of coffee on my desk. Jennifer had an uncanny ability to read people, probably developed during her psychology degree before she switched to engineering. "Just trying to figure out a pattern," I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Work pattern or life pattern?" "Life," I admitted. "Celeste has been different lately, working more team dinners, new routines." Jennifer raised an eyebrow but said nothing, which somehow felt more significant than any advice she might have offered. The morning passed in the familiar rhythm of calculations and client calls, but my mind kept drifting back to those small anomalies. During lunch, I found myself opening our joint checking account on my phone, a habit I'd developed years ago to track our household budget. What I saw made me pause mid-bite of my sandwich. 3 charges at Nordstrom in the past month, totaling over $800. Celeste hadn't mentioned any shopping trips, and she typically showed me new purchases with the enthusiasm of someone seeking validation for smart finds. Then there were the restaurant charges, expensive places I didn't recognize, always on weekdays, always during lunch hours. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred, trying to construct a rational explanation. Maybe Duncan's team dinners were fancier than I'd assumed. Maybe she was buying gifts for upcoming birthdays I'd forgotten. Maybe. But the engineer in me couldn't ignore the data. That evening, Celeste arrived home at 9:47 p.m. I noted the time without meaning to, the way I automatically recorded measurements at work sites. She looked perfectly composed, her makeup still intact, not a strand of her blonde hair out of place. "How was the team dinner?" I asked, looking up from my laptop where I'd been reviewing structural drawings for a new office building. "Long," she said, kicking off her heels with apparent relief. "Duncan wanted to go through every line item of the budget. You know how CFOs are." I didn't actually. I'd never met Duncan Blackwood, despite the fact that he'd apparently become a significant presence in my wife's professional life. Another anomaly. "Where did you end up going?" She paused just for a moment while reaching for a glass from the cabinet. "That new place downtown, Prohibition something." I nodded, filed the information away, and returned to my drawings. But later, as Celeste showered, I found myself Googling restaurants with Prohibition in the name. There were 3 in Minneapolis. Only one had opened recently, Prohibition Kitchen, an upscale gastropub in the North Loop with entrees starting at $35. I checked our bank account again. No charges at Prohibition Kitchen, but there was a $67 charge at Café Lurkat, a restaurant known more for intimate atmosphere than team meetings. The water stopped running upstairs. I closed my laptop and tried to push away the growing unease in my chest, but it settled there like a weight I couldn't calculate away. Over the next 2 weeks, I began to notice things with the precision I usually reserved for structural surveys. Celeste's phone, which used to sit casually on counters and tables, now remained constantly in her hand or pocket. She'd started taking calls in our bedroom with the door closed, explaining them as work discussions that required privacy. Her gym bag appeared and disappeared on a schedule that didn't match her stated workout routine. Then came the evening when everything shifted into sharper focus. I discovered the truth the way most people do in our digital age, through a moment of careless accident that revealed careful deception. It was a Thursday in early April, rain drumming against our bedroom windows as I worked on my laptop in bed. Celeste had gone to shower after another late evening, claiming a client dinner this time with a pharmaceutical company considering a rebrand. She'd left her phone charging on the nightstand, face up, the way she always did. The screen lit up with a notification. My eyes flicked toward it automatically, expecting to see a work email or maybe a text from her sister. Instead, I saw a message preview that made my stomach drop. Duncan, can't wait to see you tomorrow. Same place, same time, 2 hearts. The phone screen dimmed before I could fully process what I'd read, but those words burned in my mind with photographic clarity. I stared at the dark screen, my engineering brain immediately seeking logical explanations, even as my gut knew there weren't any innocent ones. The shower was still running. Steam crept under the bathroom door, creating a thin fog that seemed to mirror my suddenly clouded thoughts. I sat frozen, holding my laptop but no longer seeing the structural drawings on the screen. 14 years of marriage. 2 miscarriages we'd weathered together. The house we'd renovated ourselves, staying up until midnight to paint the kitchen the exact shade of blue Celeste had fallen in love with at a home show. The way she still reached for my hand during movies, unconsciously, like muscle memory. The water stopped. I forced myself to focus on my laptop screen, but the numbers and lines seemed meaningless now. Celeste emerged from the bathroom wrapped in her terry cloth robe, her hair damp and smelling of that new bergamot shampoo. "Still working?" she asked, settling on her side of the bed with her own laptop. I managed, not trusting my voice for actual words. She picked up her phone, glanced at the screen, and I watched her face carefully. No change in expression, no sign that she'd seen Duncan's message. Either she was an exceptional actress, or she'd become so comfortable with deception that even incriminating evidence didn't faze her. "I have another late meeting tomorrow," she said, fingers moving across her phone's screen. "The pharmaceutical project is really taking off." I nodded, still staring at my laptop, wondering if she was responding to Duncan's text right in front of me. The casual cruelty of it, if that's what it was, struck me like a physical blow. That night I lay awake listening to Celeste's even breathing beside me, my mind racing through possibilities and plans. I could confront her directly, demand explanations, force a conversation that might end our marriage in a single night. Or I could do what I'd been trained to do, gather data, analyze patterns, and build a complete picture before drawing conclusions. The engineer in me won. The next morning, I called my brother Finn. As the owner of Holmstrom Security Solutions, he specialized in corporate investigations and employee background checks. More importantly, he'd been through his own divorce 3 years earlier and understood the importance of having complete information before making life-altering decisions. "I need to ask you something," I said, standing in my office with the door closed, watching traffic move past my windows like a slowly flowing equation. "Shoot. If someone wanted to verify whether their spouse was being honest about their activities, what would be the most effective approach?" Finn was quiet for a moment. Then, "Garrett, what's going on?" I told him about the text, the financial anomalies, the pattern of behavior changes. Finn listened without judgment, asking clarifying questions with the professionalism that had made his business successful. "You need proof before you do anything," he said finally. Suspicion isn't evidence, and evidence isn't always what it seems. Give me a couple days to put together some options for you. I'm not sure I want to be the kind of person who spies on his wife. You're also not the kind of person who deserves to be lied to, Finn replied gently. Sometimes the people we love force us into situations we never wanted to be in. That afternoon, while Celeste attended her mysterious meeting, I found myself doing something I'd never imagined, conducting a systematic investigation of my own marriage. I started with our shared laptop, the one we used for household finances and vacation planning. Celeste had always been casual about password security, often asking me to log into her accounts to print confirmations or pay bills. Her browser history told a story I didn't want to read. Restaurant reviews for places I'd never heard of. Hotel websites, not for vacation planning but specific property pages with amenities and room features highlighted. Most damning of all, a series of Google searches that painted a picture of careful deception. Best lunch spots for privacy Minneapolis. How to delete text message history iPhone. Signs your spouse suspects cheating. My hands shook as I screenshot each page, creating a digital file that felt like documentation of my marriage's death certificate. But the worst discovery came when I accessed our cell phone account online. Celeste's call and text logs revealed a pattern of daily communication with Duncan's number, hundreds of texts, some lasting hours into the night when she'd claimed to be sleeping beside me. The calls always happened during her lunch breaks or my commute home, moments when she knew I wouldn't be around to overhear. I printed everything: call logs, bank statements, browser history, restaurant reviews, creating a file that grew thicker each day like evidence of a structural failure I'd been too blind to see developing. That evening, Celeste returned home at 10:15 p.m., claiming the client dinner had run long because the pharmaceutical team wanted to discuss expanding their marketing budget. "How did it go?" I asked, looking up from the blueprints I'd been pretending to study. "Really well," she said, her eyes bright with what I now recognized as post-deception adrenaline. "Duncan thinks we might land their biggest contract yet." Duncan, always Duncan. "That's great," I said, watching her face. "Maybe I should meet him sometime. He sounds like an important part of your work life." For just a moment, something flickered across her expression, panic, maybe, or calculation. Then she smiled. "Sure, maybe at the next company party." But I knew there wouldn't be a next company party for us. I was already planning my exit strategy, gathering evidence with the same methodical precision I brought to structural assessments. Because if 14 years of marriage had taught me anything, it was that Celeste never did anything without a plan. I needed to make sure mine was better. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Duncan Blackwood's teenage daughter. It was a Saturday afternoon in late April when I encountered Maya Blackwood at the Starbucks near our house. I'd been working on my laptop, ostensibly reviewing project specifications, but actually researching divorce attorneys, when I overheard a familiar name. "Dad's been acting so weird lately," the girl was saying to her friend, her voice carrying the frustrated tone teenagers perfected. "Like sneaking around and taking these mysterious phone calls. Mom says he's having a midlife crisis, but I think it's more than that." I looked up, recognizing the girl from the LinkedIn photos I'd found during my research into Duncan's background. Maya Blackwood, 17, honor roll student, varsity soccer player. In another life, she might have been the kind of kid Celeste and I would have raised. "My parents are getting divorced anyway," Maya continued, stirring her frappuccino aggressively. "Mom found out he's been stealing money from their company to pay for his little adventures." My coffee went cold in my hands. Stealing money. The girl kept talking, oblivious to my presence at the nearby table. She hired some forensic accountant who found, like, $60,000 missing from the marketing budget. Dad's been using company credit cards for hotels and restaurants and stuff, probably trying to impress some woman. $60,000. I thought about all those expensive restaurant charges on our joint account, the ones I'd assumed Celeste was paying for. If Duncan was embezzling company funds to finance his affair, and if Celeste knew about it. My phone buzzed with a text from Celeste, working late again tonight. Duncan found some discrepancies in the quarterly reports that need immediate attention. Discrepancies. The word took on new meaning as I stared at Maya Blackwood, 17 years old, and unknowingly providing the missing piece of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for weeks. That evening, I called Finn with new urgency. "I need you to look into something," I said. "Financial irregularities at Celeste's company. Her supervisor might be embezzling funds, and I think she's involved." "Jesus, Garrett, this is getting complicated." It was always complicated, I just didn't know how much. Finn's investigation took 3 days and cost me $2,000 I paid from my personal account. What he discovered exceeded my worst fears. Duncan Blackwood had been systematically siphoning money from Morrison Healthcare Marketing's client accounts for 8 months, creating false invoices and redirecting payments to a personal account he'd established. The amounts were small enough to avoid immediate detection, but large enough to fund an expensive lifestyle. Hotel rooms, restaurant bills, jewelry purchases, and a lease on a downtown apartment I'd never heard of. More damaging for Celeste, Finn's report included bank records showing deposits into her personal account, money that coincided with Duncan's withdrawals from the company. She wasn't just having an affair, she was profiting from embezzlement. "There's more," Finn said when he delivered the report to my office. "I found the apartment lease. It's in Duncan's name, but I cross-referenced the timing with your wife's phone location data." He handed me a printout that showed Celeste's location during her supposed team dinners and client meetings. The data painted a clear picture. She'd been at Duncan's apartment every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon for the past 3 months, always during hours when she'd claimed to be at legitimate work functions. "What do you want to do with this?" Finn asked. I stared at the documents spread across my desk. Call logs, financial records, location data, photographic evidence of a life I'd been living blind to for months. The weight of it felt like a structural load I hadn't calculated for, threatening to collapse everything I'd built. "I want to end this," I said finally, "all of it." That night, I sat in my home office organizing evidence into categories: affair documentation, financial fraud, company theft, personal deception. Each folder grew thicker as I added bank statements, phone records, and email printouts. I felt like an architect designing the destruction of my own life, but also its reconstruction. Celeste was upstairs in our bedroom, probably texting Duncan, planning their next meeting, their next theft, their next lie. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity that reminded me why I'd become an engineer. Complex problems had solutions if you approached them systematically and refused to let emotion cloud your calculations. I opened my laptop and began typing. The first email went to Morrison Healthcare Marketing's CEO, Rebecca Morrison, Celeste's mother. I attached financial records showing the embezzlement pattern, employee credit card abuse, and suspicious account transfers. I didn't mention the affair directly, but I included enough evidence to trigger an immediate internal investigation. The second email went to my divorce attorney, whom I'd retained the previous week. I attached comprehensive documentation of infidelity, requested immediate separation proceedings, and specified that I wanted our marital assets protected pending financial fraud investigations. The third email was the hardest to write. It went to Celeste. "Celeste, by the time you read this, you'll have received calls from your mother and probably from Duncan. I've discovered your affair and your involvement in the embezzlement of company funds. I've provided evidence to the appropriate parties. I've filed for divorce. My attorney will contact you Monday morning with the paperwork. I've moved out of our house. Don't try to contact me except through lawyers. I loved you for 14 years. I'm sorry it ended this way, but you made choices that forced mine. Garrett." I scheduled all 3 emails to send at 8 a.m. Monday morning, then packed a suitcase and drove to Finn's house. As I lay on his guest room bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. Not happiness, that would take time, but the solid satisfaction of a problem correctly analyzed and systematically solved. My phone buzzed once around midnight. A text from Celeste: "Can't sleep, missing you, 2 hearts." I turned off my phone and slept better than I had in weeks. Monday morning arrived like a carefully orchestrated implosion. I was sitting in my office, ostensibly reviewing project timelines but actually watching the clock, when the first domino fell. 8:03 a.m., my phone rang, Finn's number. "It started," he said. "My contact at the phone company confirmed the emails went through. Also, there's already police activity at your wife's office building. 8:17 a.m., an unknown number calling my cell phone. I let it go to voicemail. Then another. Then three more in rapid succession. 8:22 a.m., a text from Celeste, what have you done? 8:24 a.m., another text, call me right now, we need to talk. 8:26 a.m., GARRETT please, this is a misunderstanding. I turned my phone face down and focused on my computer screen, but Jennifer Chen appeared in my doorway within minutes. Are you okay? She asked. You look like someone who's just set off a controlled demolition. That's exactly what I've done, I said, and found myself smiling for the first time in weeks. The full scope of the morning's events became clear through a series of calls from my attorney, Sarah Hendricks. At 8:30, she reported that Morrison Healthcare Marketing had immediately suspended both Celeste and Duncan pending investigation. At 9:15, she confirmed that the police had been contacted regarding financial crimes. At 10:45, she called with news that Duncan had already hired a criminal defense attorney. Your wife is trying to reach you through my office, Sarah said during our 11 a.m. call. She claims she wants to explain everything. There's nothing to explain, I said. I have phone records, bank statements, location data, and witness testimony. The pattern is clear. She's suggesting that Duncan manipulated her, that she was a victim of his scheme rather than a participant. I thought about the text messages between them that I'd discovered, the intimate tone, the careful planning of their meetings. Does the evidence support that narrative? Not remotely. Your documentation shows clear financial benefit and willing participation. She's going to have a difficult time claiming victimhood. That afternoon, while Celeste's world collapsed in Minneapolis office buildings and legal consultations, I drove to my favorite spot in Minnehaha Park. The falls rushed over limestone cliffs with the mechanical precision I'd always found comforting, water following the path of least resistance according to immutable physical laws. My phone buzzed constantly, more unknown numbers, more desperate texts from Celeste, calls from her mother that I didn't answer. Each notification felt like confirmation that my calculations had been correct, my evidence had been sufficient, my timing had been precise. At 3 p.m., Finn called with an update that surprised even me. Duncan's daughter contacted my office, he said. Maya, she wants to meet with you. Why? She said she has information about her father that might help your case. Apparently, she's been keeping track of his activities for her mother's divorce proceedings, and she thinks there's more fraud than what we've already uncovered. An hour later, I sat across from Maya Blackwood in the same Starbucks where I'd first overheard her complaints about her father's behavior. She looked younger than 17, with dark circles under her eyes and the defeated posture of someone who'd been forced to grow up too quickly. I'm sorry about your marriage, she said without preamble. My dad ruins everything he touches. You said you had information that might help. She slid a flash drive across the table.
The story's only halfway done, but revenge never waits. Like and subscribe so you never miss a burn.
Dad doesn't know I installed monitoring software on our home computer last year. Mom asked me to keep track of his online activities for their divorce. I've been collecting evidence for months. What kind of evidence? Email accounts he doesn't know I can access, dating app profiles, financial documents he tried to delete. She paused, looking out the window. Pictures of your wife. My stomach tightened. Pictures. Hotel rooms, restaurants, places they went together. She turned back to me, her eyes steady despite her youth. I can also prove he's been embezzling money from other accounts, not just the marketing budget. The forensic accountant my mom hired thinks it might be over $200,000. 200,000. The number hit me like a structural failure I hadn't anticipated. Why are you giving this to me? I asked. Because you seem like a good person, and good people shouldn't be destroyed by my father's selfishness. She stood up, shouldering her backpack. Also because your wife knew exactly what kind of man she was getting involved with. She made her choices. That evening, I reviewed the contents of Maya's flash drive with the methodical attention I brought to complex engineering projects. What I found exceeded my expectations for thoroughness and devastating clarity. Duncan's personal emails revealed a pattern of financial fraud extending back 18 months, involving multiple client accounts and sophisticated money laundering through shell companies. His communications with Celeste showed not a vulnerable woman being manipulated, but an active participant who suggested several of the more creative embezzlement schemes. Most damning were the photos. Celeste and Duncan in hotel rooms, on weekend trips I'd never heard about, wearing jewelry and clothes that far exceeded what their legitimate salaries could afford. The timestamps on the images corresponded exactly with days when Celeste had claimed to be attending work conferences or visiting her sister. But it was the final folder on Maya's drive that provided the most shocking revelation. Duncan had been planning to leave his wife and recommended that Celeste divorce me, not out of love, but because their embezzlement scheme was about to be discovered. The emails discussed liquidating marital assets, transferring money to offshore accounts, and relocating to a non-extradition country. They hadn't just been having an affair. They'd been planning to steal everything I'd worked for and disappear. I called Sarah Hendricks immediately. "This changes everything," she said after I'd explained Maya's evidence. "We're not just looking at adultery and embezzlement anymore. This is conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and planned asset theft. I need to contact the FBI." The FBI? Financial crimes crossing state lines, potential flight risk, amounts exceeding federal thresholds. Your wife isn't just facing divorce anymore, Garrett. She's looking at serious prison time. That night, for the first time since discovering Celeste's betrayal, I felt something approaching satisfaction. Not happiness. That would take time to rebuild, but the solid comfort of a job completed correctly. I'd trusted my instincts, gathered evidence systematically, and uncovered a truth more complex and damaging than I'd initially suspected. My phone buzzed one last time before I turned it off for the night. A text from an unknown number. "This is Duncan. We need to talk. There are things about Celeste you don't understand. She's not who you think she is." I deleted the message without responding. Whatever Celeste was or wasn't, she was no longer my problem to solve. I'd done my calculations, executed my plan, and documented my findings with engineering precision. The controlled demolition was complete. Now came the more challenging work of designing something new from the cleared foundation. The aftermath unfolded like a complex engineering failure analysis, multiple systems collapsing in sequence, each failure triggering the next in a cascade I'd set in motion, but could no longer control. Tuesday morning brought news that Duncan Blackwood had been arrested at his downtown apartment, charged with embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Wednesday's headlines in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune featured Morrison Healthcare marketing in a story about corporate theft that sent shockwaves through the local business community. By Thursday, Celeste had hired a criminal defense attorney and was reportedly cooperating with federal investigators. I learned these details not from direct involvement, but from Sarah Hendricks' updates and the occasional text from Finn, who'd been monitoring the situation with professional interest. The investigation had grown beyond anything I'd anticipated, encompassing not just Duncan's theft from Morrison Healthcare, but similar schemes at his two previous employers. "Your wife picked the wrong partner for her midlife crisis," Sarah told me during our Friday meeting. "Duncan Blackwood apparently has a 20-year history of financial fraud. The FBI thinks he's stolen over $500,000 across multiple companies. And Celeste, she's claiming she was manipulated, that she didn't understand the extent of his criminal activities." Sarah shuffled through documents on her desk. "But the evidence suggests otherwise. The emails show her actively participating in planning, suggesting methods, and accepting direct financial benefits." I nodded, feeling oddly detached from the drama consuming my former life. The methodical revelation of facts felt like reviewing structural calculations, each piece of evidence supporting the overall conclusion with mathematical certainty. "What's her likely outcome?" "Minimum 2 years federal prison, possibly 5 depending on plea negotiations. Her cooperation with investigators might reduce the sentence, but she's definitely facing jail time." That afternoon, I sat in my office reviewing blueprints for a new residential development when Jennifer Chen knocked on my door frame. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her expression unreadable. "I'm not taking any calls from." "It's Eleanor Morrison, Celeste's mother. My stomach dropped. Alina Morrison had been a second mother to me during my marriage, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays and sent thoughtful Christmas gifts and always asked about my projects with genuine interest. Facing her now felt like the most difficult conversation I'd had since this entire situation began. Alina looked older than her 68 years as she sat across from my desk, her usually perfect silver hair slightly disheveled, her hands trembling as she reached for the coffee Jennifer had brought. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "Mrs. Morrison, you don't. Please let me say this." Her voice carried the authority that had made her successful in business for 4 decades. "I've spent the last week reviewing financial records, talking to investigators, and trying to understand how my own daughter could have participated in stealing from my company." I waited, knowing that Alina Morrison never spoke without having thoroughly organized her thoughts first. "What Celeste did was unforgivable," she continued. "Not just the affair, marriages fail, people make mistakes, but the theft, the lies, the deliberate deception of everyone who trusted her." She looked directly at me. "Including you. I'm sorry this happened to your company. My company will survive. I'm more concerned about the damage she's done to people who didn't deserve it." Alina's voice softened slightly. "You were a good husband to her, Garrett. Whatever mistakes you think you made, whatever problems existed in your marriage, none of it justified what she chose to do." We sat in silence for a moment, watching traffic move past my office windows like a slow-motion structural load test. "The investigators want to interview you," Alina said finally. "About what?" "Financial patterns in your joint accounts, whether you had any knowledge of the embezzlement." She paused. "I told them you're the most honest person I know, that if you'd suspected financial crimes, you would have reported them immediately." "Thank you." "I also told them that if you'd known about the affair earlier, you would have handled it exactly the way you did, systematically, legally, and without vindictive drama." She smiled sadly. "You're an engineer, even in your personal life." After Alina left, I found myself thinking about the different ways people responded to betrayal. Some acted on emotion, confronting immediately and explosively. Others retreated into denial, hoping problems would resolve themselves. I'd chosen the path that felt most natural to my training: gather evidence, analyze patterns, and implement solutions based on data rather than feelings. The approach had been devastatingly effective, but it had also isolated me from the emotional process of grieving my marriage. I'd been so focused on solving the problem that I'd barely acknowledged the loss. That evening, I drove to the house Celeste and I had shared, ostensibly to collect more of my belongings, but really to confront the physical space of our former life together. The neighbors' lights cast shadows across our carefully maintained lawn, illuminating the garden Celeste had planted the previous spring with optimism I now understood to be performance rather than genuine hope. Inside, the house felt like a museum of decisions made by different people in what seemed like a previous lifetime. The kitchen island where Celeste had stood reading Duncan's texts. The living room where we'd planned vacations we'd never take. The bedroom where she'd lain beside me while carrying on an elaborate deception. I packed methodically: tools, books, the few pieces of furniture that felt personally meaningful. As I worked, I found myself cataloging memories with the same analytical approach I'd used to document her betrayal. 14 years of shared experiences, sorted into categories of genuine moments versus performed ones, honest communications versus calculated deceptions. My phone buzzed as I loaded the last box into my truck, a text from an unknown number. "Garrett, this is Celeste. I'm using a friend's phone because my lawyer said not to contact you directly, but I need you to know that I never meant for things to go this far. Duncan convinced me that we were just borrowing money temporarily, that we'd pay it back before anyone noticed. I know you won't believe me, but I do love you. I always loved you." I stared at the message for a long time, trying to reconcile it with the evidence I'd collected. Even now, facing federal charges and the destruction of her career, Celeste was rewriting history, repositioning herself as a victim of circumstances rather than an architect of choices. I deleted the message without responding and drove away from the house for the last time. As I merged onto the highway, I realized that the structural analysis of my marriage was finally complete. I'd identified the points of failure, documented the causes, and implemented corrective measures to prevent future collapse. The process had been painful but necessary, like surgical removal of structural elements, that had become load-bearing threats rather than sources of support. Now came the more challenging phase, designing and building something new from a foundation I could trust. 6 months later, I stood in the courthouse lobby holding a manila folder containing the finalized divorce decree and the final chapter of a life I'd systematically dismantled and rebuilt. The Minnesota autumn light filtered through tall windows, casting geometric shadows that reminded me why I'd always found comfort in the predictable behavior of natural forces. Celeste had been sentenced the previous week, 3 years federal prison, 2 years supervised release, and full restitution of $247,000 to Morrison Healthcare Marketing and other affected clients. Duncan received 5 years, his longer sentence reflecting both the scope of his crimes and his status as the scheme's architect. The local news had covered the sentencing with the kind of breathless attention usually reserved for political scandals, complete with financial crime experts explaining how sophisticated embezzlement schemes operated in modern corporate environments. I'd watched the coverage from my new apartment in northeast Minneapolis, a converted warehouse space that felt like a physical manifestation of starting over. The exposed brick walls and industrial fixtures suited my current mindset, stripped down to essentials, honest about their materials, designed for function rather than performance. "You look like someone who's just completed a major construction project," said Jennifer Chen, appearing beside me in the courthouse lobby. She'd driven me to the final hearing, claiming she wanted to make sure I didn't get overwhelmed by the legal terminology, though I suspected she was more concerned about my tendency to process emotional events like engineering problems. "I feel like I've been building something for months without knowing what the final structure would look like," I said, sliding the divorce papers into my briefcase with the same care I used for important blueprints. "And now I know it's solid." We walked out into the crisp October air, Minneapolis's skyline sharp against a cloudless sky. The city felt different than it had 6 months earlier, not changed exactly, but seen through eyes that had learned to identify structural weaknesses before they became catastrophic failures. My phone buzzed with a text from Maya Blackwood, saw the news about the sentencing. "Thank you for making sure my dad faced consequences. Mom and I are doing better now." Maya had become an unexpected ally during the investigation, her forensic documentation of her father's activities proving crucial to the FBI's case. At 17, she'd shown more integrity and courage than most adults I knew, including her father and my ex-wife. Her mother had filed for divorce the day after Duncan's arrest and was now running the marketing company she'd inherited when her own father retired. "What's next?" Jennifer asked as we reached my truck. "Honestly, I'm looking forward to Boring." She laughed. "Boring is underrated. Boring means your foundation is solid enough to support whatever you want to build on it." That afternoon, I sat in my new office space, reviewing plans for a community center project that would break ground the following spring. The work felt meaningful in ways my previous projects hadn't, designing spaces where people would gather, create, and build connections based on shared interests rather than shared deceptions. Finn stopped by around 4 p.m., carrying coffee and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose professional expertise had been thoroughly validated. "You know what I learned from all this?" he said, settling into the chair across from my drafting table. "What?" "The people who are most suspicious of others are usually the ones with the most to hide. Celeste spent so much energy worrying about whether you suspected her that she never considered whether her behavior was actually suspicious." I thought about that, how Celeste's increasing paranoia about my potential discovery had led to exactly the kind of careful documentation that had exposed her crimes. Her attempts to cover her tracks had created more evidence, her lies had required more lies, and her fear of being caught had made being caught inevitable. "She created her own structural failure," I said. "Exactly, and you," Finn grinned. "You built the strongest case I've ever seen. Federal prosecutors said your documentation was better than most professional investigations." That evening, I drove to Minnehaha Park for the first time since the morning I'd discovered Duncan's text on Celeste's phone. The falls looked exactly the same, water following the path of least resistance according to immutable physical laws, but my relationship to them had changed. Instead of seeking comfort in their mechanical predictability, I found myself appreciating their constant motion, the way they carved new channels while respecting the underlying geological structure. My phone rang as I watched the water cascade over limestone cliffs, an unknown number which I'd learned to answer cautiously during the investigation. "Garrett, this is Rebecca Morrison, Eleanor's daughter-in-law." It took me a moment to place the name. Eleanor's son's wife, someone I'd met perhaps 3 times during family gatherings over the years. "Hi, Rebecca. I hope it's okay that I'm calling. Mom gave me your number. I wanted to thank you for what you did." "I didn't do anything except protect myself." "You did more than that." Her voice carried conviction I hadn't expected. "You exposed criminal activity that could have destroyed my mother's company and stolen money from dozens of clients. You did it legally, systematically, and without destroying people who didn't deserve to be hurt." I wasn't sure how to respond to gratitude for dismantling my own marriage. "Also," Rebecca continued, "I wanted you to know that Mom is planning to offer you a consulting contract. Morrison Healthcare is expanding into medical facility design, and she thinks your structural engineering expertise would be valuable. Working with Eleanor Morrison would mean maintaining a connection to Celeste's family, even after our marriage had ended in federal court. But it would also mean working with people who understood the importance of integrity and had demonstrated their commitment to it when it mattered most." "I'd be interested in discussing that," I said. After Rebecca hung up, I remained at the park until the sun set behind Minneapolis's skyline, turning the rushing water into liquid gold. For the first time in months, I felt something approaching excitement about the future, not the desperate optimism of someone trying to escape a bad situation, but the solid satisfaction of someone who had built a foundation strong enough to support whatever came next. My marriage to Celeste had failed, but not because I'd been inadequate or inattentive or insufficient in some fundamental way. It had failed because she'd chosen deception over honesty, theft over integrity, and performance over authenticity. Those were her choices, her structural failures, her consequences to face. I'd chosen differently. When confronted with evidence of betrayal, I'd gathered more evidence instead of jumping to conclusions. When faced with emotional chaos, I'd created systematic order. When dealing with people who lied, I'd insisted on documentation and verification. The approach had been methodical rather than dramatic, legal rather than vengeful, protective rather than destructive. It had worked. 2 years after the sentencing, I received an unexpected piece of mail at my engineering office. A handwritten letter from the Federal Correctional Institution in Wayska, Minnesota. "Garrett, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand if you throw this letter away without reading it. But I wanted you to know that I've spent the past 2 years thinking about what I did and why I did it, and I finally understand something important. You were never the problem in our marriage. I was. Not because you were perfect. Nobody is, but because you were honest, and I couldn't handle being around someone whose integrity made my choices look as ugly as they really were. I convinced myself that you were boring, that our life together wasn't exciting enough, that I deserved something more dramatic and passionate. But what I really couldn't stand was how your consistency made my selfishness obvious, even to me. Duncan didn't seduce me away from a happy marriage. He offered me a way to justify choices I was already making, to prioritize my own desires over our shared commitments, to take what I wanted without considering who it would hurt, to live like the rules that applied to everyone else didn't apply to me. I know this probably sounds like more manipulation, another attempt to rewrite history to make myself look better. Maybe it is. Prison gives you a lot of time to think, but it doesn't necessarily make you more honest with yourself. But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Not just for the affair or the theft or the lies, but for wasting 14 years of your life with someone who didn't appreciate what she had until she destroyed it completely. I hope you've built something better. You deserve someone who sees your steadiness as strength rather than limitation, your integrity as a gift rather than a burden. I won't contact you again. Celeste." I read the letter twice, then filed it in the manila folder containing all the documentation from our divorce. Not because I needed more evidence of her guilt, that had been established definitively 2 years earlier, but because it felt like the final piece of a structural analysis that had begun with suspicious text messages and ended with federal convictions. The letter didn't change anything. Celeste would serve her full sentence, the restitution had already been paid, and our divorce had been finalized for 18 months. But it provided something I hadn't realized I needed: confirmation that my analytical approach to the crisis had been correct, that the evidence I'd gathered had told the true story, and that the choices I'd made had been based on accurate information rather than emotional assumptions. That afternoon, I drove to the worksite of the community center that had been under construction for 8 months. The project was ahead of schedule and under budget, a result of careful planning and systematic attention to detail. As I walked through the framed structure, checking measurements and reviewing progress with the construction foreman, I felt the deep satisfaction that came from building something designed to last. "Solid work," said the foreman, a weathered man named Carl who'd been in construction for 30 years. "Best foundation I've seen in a long time. Whatever you build on this, it's not going anywhere." Standing in the skeletal frame of a building that would serve the community for decades, surrounded by the honest smell of sawdust and concrete, I realized that Carl's assessment applied to more than just the construction project. I'd spent 2 years building a new life on a foundation of verified truth, documented evidence, and methodical decision-making. Whatever I chose to construct next, professionally, personally, emotionally, would be built on solid ground. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer Chen. "New client wants to meet next week about designing a medical research facility. Interested in collaborating?" I typed back, "Absolutely. Send me the project details." The future felt like a blueprint waiting to be drafted, a structure waiting to be designed, a problem waiting to be solved with the same systematic approach that had carried me through the worst period of my life. I'd learned that trust, like structural integrity, had to be earned through consistency and verified through testing. I'd learned that some people would always choose performance over authenticity, but that didn't mean authenticity was worthless. It just meant I needed to be more careful about who I trusted with it. Most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the most devastating betrayals revealed truths that needed to be discovered, that systematic investigation could expose deeper problems than surface symptoms suggested, and that facing difficult realities was always preferable to living with comfortable illusions. As I drove away from the construction site, heading toward an evening of project planning and structural calculations, I felt the solid confidence that came from knowing my foundation could support whatever I chose to build next. The controlled demolition of my old life had been painful but necessary. The new construction was just beginning.
That was intense, but was it right? Tell us what you would have done. Like, comment, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next hot dish straight from Revenge Kitchen.